Good evening, everybody. How you doing? Good. Boy, I always want to know where the vocal guy is going to be. I'm Gary Sieber. I'll be your host for tonight. It is my pleasure to be here, and welcome to this special event presented by the Owls Club of Elkhart. And how many of you are owls? All right. What a great group, doing great things in the community, and it's been almost exactly, is it exactly to the day, 1 year that you opened your doors? That's what I understand. That's fabulous. So congratulations on that. How many of you celebrated our country's bicentennial in 1976? Yep. Me too. And I suppose if we all meet the age criteria for the Owls Club, that sort of stands to reason, doesn't it? But you may not realize it. The 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence is now just a couple of years away, 2026, right? And all those words that we hold so dear will once again be celebrated for their enduring ability to serve as the glue that has held our nation together through good times and bad. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great, great words. In some circles these days, something called originalism has become ascendant. Originalism means interpreting the Constitution as it would have been understood, or as it was intended to be understood by those who wrote it at the very time that they wrote it. So, going back to the venerated preamble to the Constitution I just read, most of us could probably take a pretty good shot at what life or liberty meant to the founders. But what did they mean by the pursuit of happiness? Did they mean that Americans should do whatever brought them pleasure? Well, it might please me to mow my lawn at 11:30 at night, but I'm not certain it would please my neighbors. Doing whatever we please seems a bad recipe for guiding a young nation that was born coming out of the Enlightenment. What about this definition of happiness? Therefore, the man, whoever he is, whose soul is tranquilized by restraints and consistency, and who is at peace with himself, so that he neither pines away in distress, nor is broken down by fear, nor consumed with the thirst of longing in pursuit of some ambition, nor maudlin in the exuberance of meaningless eagerness. He is the wise man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man. Fortunately, we're blessed to have with us tonight a man who may not always live up to that definition provided by the ancient Roman philosopher Cicero, but is certainly a genuine originalist in the sense that he has relentlessly pursued the question of what the founders of our country actually meant when they wrote those immortal words, the pursuit of happiness. His New York Times best-selling book carries that very title, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. Jeffrey Rosen is president and CEO of the National Constitution Center. We'll talk more about that, where he hosts a weekly podcast of constitutional debate, if you'd care to tune in. He is also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor at The Atlantic, a wonderful magazine. A graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and Yale Law School. How many of you have that in your pedigree?
I'm sorry.
I went to Plymouth Canton High School. Yeah. He has authored 7 books, including studies of U.S. Supreme Court Justices Louis Brandeis. Fantastic. I really want to talk about Brandeis as well. Maybe we could do that at a separate event. William Howard Taft and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. His essays and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, on National Public Radio, in New Republic, where he was their legal affairs editor, and in The New Yorker, where he worked as a staff writer. The Los Angeles Times called him the nation's most widely read and influential legal commentator, and these days, we all know there's a lot of commentating to do on legal matters and the Supreme Court. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our honored guest here tonight at the Owls Club, Mr. Jeffrey Rosen. Jeff, let me first convey the sincere thanks of everyone here and all those who may see this on recorded version later for joining us and making the trip. You flew in this evening from New York and some small little place, out on the East Coast, and joined us here in Elkhart. Let's just start with a very basic question. This book really struck me as soon as I saw the title, The Pursuit of Happiness. What does that mean? How did you get started working on a book with this as the subject?
Well, first of all, let me say, hello, Owls Club. I'm so excited to be here, and how impressive it is that we have hundreds of lifelong learners like you who've just turned out in this community because you want to learn about the pursuit of happiness. And I was so honored when Frank Martin reached out and said that he had this great community that wanted to talk about the book. And this is a unique event that you're all convened here together, people of different backgrounds, because you want to learn. So I'm completely honored to be here with you. And I'm excited to share with you the unusual quest that led to this book. So it was during COVID, and a series of synchronicities, kind of unexpected coincidences, led me to try to figure out what Thomas Jefferson meant when he used those famous words about the pursuit of happiness. First, I was rereading the section of Benjamin Franklin's autobiography where he said that in his 20s, he set out to achieve moral perfection. And Ben Franklin is, 22, he's in Philly, and he decides to make a list of 12 virtues that he wants to work on every day. Industry, prudence, order, cleanliness. He saves the one he finds hardest for last, humility. And he puts that on his list, and he makes a chart with 12 virtues on one side and the days of the week on the other. And every night of the week, he resolves to work on a different virtue. If he falls short of it, he wants to put an X mark, and so he can improve himself. He tries this for a while. He finds it's really depressing because there are all these X marks every night. But he thinks he's better for having tried. Okay, I knew about this system. I tried it myself years ago on the suggestion of a local rabbi who knew about the Franklin system. But a friend and I tried it. We made an X mark every night where we fell short. We also found it very depressing, but we enjoyed trying it. But what I noticed during COVID is that Franklin had chosen as his motto a line from this book that I'd never heard of called The Tusculan Disputations by Cicero, and it said, without virtue, happiness cannot be. Okay, a few weeks later, I was at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where they love Thomas Jefferson, and in the room of the hotel at UVA was a list of 12 virtues that Thomas Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. And they were almost identical to Franklin's cleanliness, industry, resolution, do what you ought and resolve to do what you resolve. Silence, if angry, count to 10, if very angry, count to 100. Jefferson had only 12 virtues on his list. There were one that Franklin had that he left off, and that was chastity, which Jefferson left off of his list. But what really struck me during COVID is that when people would write to Jefferson and say, what's the secret of happiness so that I can achieve these virtues, he would send a passage that you just read. I closed my eyes because I wanted to hear the words, each one of them so well. It was the passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. He who has tranquility of soul, who's neither exuberant nor despondent, he is the wise man of whom we're in quest. He's the happy man. So basically during COVID, I thought, I've got to read this book, The Tusculan Disputations, because it was so important for Franklin and Jefferson in summing up their understanding of happiness as being good, not feeling good, the pursuit of virtue, not the pursuit of pleasure. A completely unexpected definition. I thought that happiness was let it all hang out. You do whatever feels great. But obviously for Jefferson and Franklin, it was something else. But what else should I read? And then I found this amazing reading list that Thomas Jefferson would send to people when they asked him, what should I read? How can I be an educated person? He would send it to kids who were going to law school. He'd send it to lifelong learners who had time in retirement. And it has all of these different sections, literature, there are novels, political philosophy, astronomy. He's very specific about the time of day that you have to read everything. You have to wake up before dawn, read for 2 hours of moral philosophy, watch the sunrise, Then after sunrise, read political philosophy and history. After lunch, astronomy, science, and natural sciences. After dinner, you're allowed some Shakespeare and poetry. And then to bed, 12 hours a day, about 12 hours a day of reading. What really caught my eye was the section that he called moral philosophy or ethics. And it starts with Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then there were these books of classical Greek and Roman moral philosophy, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus's Endycrion, and also some Enlightenment philosophers, John Locke, Francis Hutcheson, Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui, Hume, and Lord Bolingbroke. Basically, I set out to read them because I thought I should. As you heard, I had this amazing education, and I'm so grateful for the incredible teachers in college and law school and grad school who taught me politics, philosophy. I was an English major, a literature major in college, but I just never read these books of moral philosophy because they'd fallen out of the curriculum by the time I was in college in the 80s. So I just thought I should, not for anything else. I wasn't planning to write a book about it. So during COVID, I decided to be like Jefferson. I got up every morning before sunrise, read for 2 hours, watched the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I just learned. And I know this sounds extremely weird. I'd never written sonnets before, but then I learned that in the founding era, a lot of people who read these great books wrote sonnets, including Alexander Hamilton, Phyllis Wheatley, the great black poet, the first published black poet, Mercy Otis Warren, the anti-federalist, and then John Quincy Adams would get up in the White House when he's president, read Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, which is his favorite book in the original, write these great sonnets, and then walk along the Potomac. So it's just kind of a creative expression, and it helps you kind of sum up the wisdom. So that's what I did. I spent a year doing it, and it changed my life. It changed what I thought about happiness. It changed what I thought about how to be a good person and a good citizen. And it changed the way I feel about what I'm supposed to be doing in the morning, which is something involving reading rather than browsing. Actually, something deep reading. I've just become a radical champion of the power of deep reading, and that's how this book came about.
Amazing, amazing. How many of you have read 2 hours of moral philosophy this morning before sunrise? This is not something we typically do in 2024. So let's talk about these people. And let's go back. We can start with Franklin. We can work our way through a cast of characters because they're all individual, but they all have this same thread that goes through it. So in a general sense, what were people like in the 18th century, the late 1700s? And we're talking about people like Franklin and Washington and Madison and Jefferson and on and on and on, these great figures of the framers of the Constitution. How different were they in terms of how they approached life versus us today?
Well, let's start with the great Franklin. He inspires this project. He's such a self-improver, of course. He's starting off in Philadelphia with Poor Richard's Almanac, and he needs copy for his paper. He's got to fill it with something. So what does he do? He goes to this ancient moral philosophy that he read as a kid. And it's really important. This is just stuff that people started reading in, I guess we'd call it middle school or high school. And they're books by preachers like Tillotson and Wollaston. They're books by Seneca and Cicero. They're books by English revolutionaries of the Whig generation against Charles I. And basically, he just sums up, early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise is a pithier version of a much more lugubrious version by some 17th century English writer. So he also wants to, he translates it to into poetry and back. Franklin writes poetry because he wants to get it into his head. And he translates these aphorisms, then he reads Pythagoras. And Pythagoras, I thought of him as the guy who invented the triangle and the harmonic system of triads and thirds. Pythagoras invented our modern tonal music. In addition to all that, he lives on the Isle of Croton as a kind of guru, and he encourages his disciples to be perfect, to be vegetarian, to exercise, to be moderate in eating and drinking, and every night before bed to take an accounting of how they've spent the day. And it's Pythagoras' self-accounting system that Franklin adopts, along with John Locke, who you may know, wrote the book, The Second Treatises of Government, that kind of inspired the American Revolution. But Locke is also big on education. He has a whole tract on how to educate kids, and he says you should start clubs of moral improvement. It's really like the Owls Club. It's exactly what Franklin is starting. You should be very proud, because it's a very Franklin-like thing to do. Franklin calls his club the Junto, which means to join. And he wants to start a united party for virtue in his community in Philly. He's not well-connected. He's a middle-class guy. He wants printers and other people who are starting off, entrepreneurs, who are going to come together because they're devoted to lifelong learning and want to promote virtue, by which he means self-mastery, self-control, character improvement, lifelong learning, like gathering like this. So Franklin, kind of copying from John Locke and Pythagoras, makes these rules for the Junto Club. That's why he drafts the virtues. And you're supposed to do it together as a community so everyone can become better. And he says that for his whole life, he wanted to write a book called The Art of Virtue that would help inspire other people to practice this. He never writes the book, but he comes up with the system. And then he becomes the greatest scientist of his time. He's the most admired philosophical character. He's chained the Gulf Stream and brought lightning from the heavens. What's at the end of his life what he's most proud of? His conciliating temperament. The fact that he learned not to say in conversation, it is this way, or I'm sure it's this way, my way or the highway, but it may be so, or it appears to me. Just be less tendentious in the assertion of his opinions. That's what allows him to be the great compromiser at the Constitutional Convention. And he doesn't say very much, but he brings both sides together, teaching them to listen to each other. And at the end of the convention, he makes this incredible speech. He says, I've lived a long life. I don't know if this is perfect, but it's the best we can do. And I'm asking you to come together in the spirit of compromise. And then this great moment, he's looking at George Washington's chair, and there's a sun on the back, which you can see when Washington stands up. And Franklin says, throughout the convention, I haven't known if it's a rising or setting sun, but I'm now optimistic that the sun is rising. So it's really striking. Isn't that amazing about Franklin, that he's so determined to connect his efforts to be a good person with being a good citizen, and all of his self-improvement and his whole philosophy is centrally shaped by the classical philosophers, by his Christian faith, and by his desire to be a good person, all suffused with this transcendent faith in reason. And you mentioned the Enlightenment, and that's going to be a theme through all of these guys. They have such faith. This is an important part of it too, that we can use our powers of reason to master or moderate our unreasonable passions or emotions. This distinction between reason and passion comes up all the time in the moral philosophy. It comes from Pythagoras, who divides our faculties or powers into reason in the head, passion, which also means emotion, in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and says we have to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and desires so we can achieve that calm tranquility that defines happiness. And that's why they're constantly trying to engage in impulse control, not to do what feels good in the moment. Do you remember the test that the kids took in the 70s at Stanford called the marshmallow test, where young kids are offered one marshmallow if they want to have it right away, but if they can wait for 15 minutes, they get 2 marshmallows. The kids who could wait for 2 marshmallows did much better later in life. They did better in their careers. They were just able to achieve their potential. And almost all of classical and Enlightenment moral philosophy is a version of the marshmallow test. It's use that power of reason to resist the immediate passion or impulse gratification so you can achieve your long-term potential. And that's what Franklin is all about, and that's what the whole Virtue Project is all about, and that's why Franklin is our greatest practical philosopher of virtue.
And I think, for many of us at least, when we think about Franklin, we probably have this cartoon character in our head. And he's the guy that shows up, for a reason I don't know why, on President's Day sales, right? On TV ads. And there's Washington, and there's Franklin. Hey, get a great deal, right? But we tend to think of him maybe as this eccentric who was, as you say, flying a kite, capturing electricity, doing something. the man was brilliant. He was probably the most brilliant mind of that era. And you think about how many brilliant people there were, Franklin was an incredible genius. And so to have him struggling with how to temper the passions in his own life is pretty remarkable when you think about all the characters that are out there today. And, how well are they doing in tempering those passions?
Well, that's the central thing. You're absolutely right. He's the most admired American of his time. He meets Voltaire in France. He's Le Grand Franklin. But he learns, not to lord it over people. He saved humility for the last item on his list because a Quaker friend told him he had to work on it. He was a kid. He was really arrogant. And, that kind of cultivated coonskin hat and the kind of kites are part of his just not trying to be haughty or arrogant, but he's both brilliant. And what's so really clarifying for me was to see how all of these great figures, we'd call them geniuses today, they're, our great founders, they all struggled every day, as we all do, just to control our tempers, not to be racked by anxiety, not to unproductively be racing ahead to think about the future or perseverate about the past, but just kind of staying focused, staying in the moment, focusing on productive work is the task for all of us. And what's so striking about them is they talked about it constantly. Franklin has a whole system to allow him to keep productive and to master his thoughts as well as his words and actions so that he can achieve his potential. All the others are like that too. It's so humanizing. Of course they were human, but to realize how candid they were about struggling with their own humanity and how they found this philosophy, which was also for almost all of them a spiritual quest, to be so helpful in just getting through the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've struggled with that question through all of human history. You can think of even Freud. I mean, ego and id, you're always battling one against the other, and the passions in the soul trying to be tempered by those moments of sanity that reason. So a little history background here. If you go back, you can think about periods of time that might involve the arts and culture and thinking and philosophy. And so you had the classical period, you had the Greeks, and then you had the Romans. You had the medieval period where, you think about, knights in shining armor. We're talking about anywhere from about 455 BC, or I should say what we used to call AD, but current era, to about 1485. And then we emerged from that, and we had the Renaissance and the Reformation. Think about paintings that you might know from the Renaissance era, works of art, things of like that type. And following the Renaissance and the Reformation, we entered into a period in about 1660 till about 1790 called the Enlightenment. And if you think about the Renaissance and the artwork and the classicism that was there, and sort of these lofty, kinds of things, the Enlightenment was let reason be your guide. Let reason be your guide. And that is what all of these characters, from John Locke to Franklin, all of the great Enlightenment philosophers, were doing. Saying, we need reason to guide us. We don't need our passions to guide us. What's interesting is after the Enlightenment, you had the period called Romanticism. People said, heck with reason, we're going to just explore these emotions. We're going to write romantic, lofty poetry. We're going to do these big, and you had Beethoven writing the music with big Florida, and it wasn't built on reason. It was built on let's explore our emotions. So every period in our history, culturally, through the world, has been a reaction to the previous period, which may explain why we are where we are today as a reaction, now the Enlightenment long over. But talk about that a little bit in terms of these gentlemen.
That's so helpful to lay it out as you just did, and you're so right to distinguish among those eras. And yes, why are we where we are today? I tried to figure out how was it that the definition of happiness literally changed so that it's the opposite of the Enlightenment definition. Sometime in the 60s, happiness came to be seen not as being good, but as feeling good. Letting it all hang out, immediate pleasure. Do you follow your own bliss? Why did that happen? Some, including George Will, who did it, we had a great book conversation about this, he blames the Enlightenment for just the reasons that you said, that it was during the Enlightenment that they rejected the age of reason. During the Romantic era, they rejected the Enlightenment faith in reason and came to exalt passion over emotion. David Brooks, when we were talking about this book, blames Freud, who you also mentioned, and says that in substituting the idea of personality for character, Freud encouraged or exalted the unregulated expression of emotions. I don't have a clear answer, and obviously it's not just a question of philosophy, but there's no doubt that once pop culture began to validate greed is good, for example, which was the mantra when I was going to college in the 80s, as opposed to the Stoic wisdom, which is greed is avarice. You have to resist luxury and immediate temptation, or else the republic will fall. Once all that began to be validated, then the definition completely changed, and all of that classical moral philosophy fell out of the curriculum. It was really standard not only in college, high school, even middle school, up through the 1950s. Justice Ginsburg, who I had the honor of writing a book with, because we had conversations over the years and we collected them into this book, said that she learned this wisdom in New York City public schools around 1950. Her mother told her the Stoic advice. She told Justice Ginsburg, overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They will distract you from productive work. And as a result of that, RBG was the most self-disciplined, productive person I've ever met. She had iron focus on her schedule. She would read and write all the time. She would be completely focused when she talked to you, but wouldn't, people could be gathered in the room talking, and she would still be doing her reading and writing, and would look up in surprise because she hadn't noticed that people came in. And she just got it from her mom and from the Stoics and from her New York City public school experience. My mom graduated from New York City public school in the same year. She was the same age, and she got it there too. So it's a really striking change in our education system, in pop culture, and in the understanding of happiness. And it all is rooted, I think, in what you identified, which is the abandonment of Enlightenment faith in reason, and the idea that we can, by applying our powers of reason, moderate or modulate our unproductive emotions so that we can improve our characters.
Any movement can go too far, right?
Yes.
And sometimes a movement becomes cliche. You do it because it's popular rather than because it works. And I'm sure that was true late in the Enlightenment period, where there was so many emotions that were left untended that you saw this sort of movement toward feeling and expression and all of that. If I might quote you from your own book, don't you love it when
please.
people do that?
I couldn't possibly.
I was going to save this for later, but since you mentioned it on page 271, one possible answer is that America's understanding of the pursuit of happiness in popular culture was transformed in the 1960s and 70s from being good to feeling good, from eudaimonia, which was the word for the pursuit of virtue, to hedonia, the pursuit of pleasure. This was a stark departure from the understanding of previous generations, although the shift began much earlier. With the dawn of the Romantic era in the 19th century, hedonia wasn't finally embraced and fully embraced by pop culture until the second half of the 20th century. The change from a popular culture that rejected pleasure-seeking to one that celebrated it marked a shift in our understanding of happiness as something that requires delayed rather than immediate gratification.
That was just a beginning effort to take a stab at it. I'd love your thoughts, too, about why the change happened, because we all lived through it. I know I was in college in the 80s, and I remember yearning for this kind of guidance. It was the greed is good decade, and pop culture was just celebrating Gordon Gekko and all that kind of stuff, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I was just looking for an alternative. And I didn't realize, because it was hiding in plain sight, because all this had fallen out of the curriculum, that's where it was. Of course, these virtues were traditionally taught in religion, in churches and synagogues, and within a spiritual tradition, but I think some of that also fell out of the wayside in the 60s as organized religion was challenged, and also as religions may have focused less on just teaching the old traditional virtues. It's tremendously clarifying to have this framework, whether you're getting it from a religious and spiritual framework or a philosophical framework, because it helps you be happier and more productive. You don't get distracted by things you can't control. The central lesson of the wisdom, which is focus on the only thing you can control, which is on your own thoughts and emotions, not the emotions and actions of others. It's the Stoic dichotomy of control, which says, don't attach to external events. We are what we think. Life is shaped by the mind, and that we should use our mind to view things realistically so that we are able to achieve the moderation that is key to happiness. It's found in all the wisdom traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism, and it's at the core of Judaism and Christianity. It's at the core of the teachings of Jesus and the Proverbs as well. He who masters himself is greater than he who taketh a village, says the proverb. And Jesus, of course, says, be perfect, even as, the Lord is perfect. So there's this kind of injunction to try to achieve a degree of moral perfection, which Franklin took from Jesus and the Greeks took from Socrates, was just such a central part of education for so long, and that's why it was so powerful for me to rediscover it.
Let's go back to some of these characters. We talked about Franklin a little bit. I'd like to spend a moment, because you have so many wonderful chapters, and they're sort of separated into particular individuals in our history and their relationships with others and sort of their own struggles with exactly what you're talking about. I want to talk about George Washington a little bit. How many of you know George Washington? Okay. He also shows up in the TV ads for President's Day sales, right? How many of you know that George Washington had a terrible temper? A couple people. Okay. He had a terrible temper, like explosive. And you write on page 145, the most striking feature of Washington's daily efforts to control his strong passions is that more often than not, he succeeded, I should say. Washington's classical reading also helped him draw the connection between personal self-government and political self-government. That's interesting to me, because I think of George Washington through the storybooks and through all the things that I remember from grade school as this sort of friendly, avuncular, white-haired, wooden teeth, nice guy. He was not. Tell me a little bit about George Washington.
This has been an exciting George Washington week for me. Yesterday, I was at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, which is the oldest surviving building in Manhattan, and that's where Washington said his farewell to the troops after the Revolution. And a few days earlier, I was at Mount Vernon, Washington's home, which is one of the most inspiring, sacred spots in America, talking about Washington. And the more I learn about Washington, the greater he seems. He's not some friendly, avuncular character, and he's also not a paper saint. His greatness was his self-mastery. He did have a terrible temper. Ron Chernow, his biographer, and the Chernow Washington biography is great if you haven't read it, thinks that it may have come from his mom, who's always criticizing him and nagging him, and in order to prevent himself from exploding at her, he tries to master his temper. He gets it from books like Seneca, which he loves, and Seneca's essays on time really inspire Washington always to be watching the clock and doing everything at the same time of day. Seneca says, time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be. That phrase that Shakespeare uses in Midsummer Night's Dream, and Washington copies it out. Washington has a famous a series of rules of civility, which some of you may have come across in national park gift shops and so forth. They're kind of like 100 rules, like the Franklin rules, about how to behave at the table. Don't scratch yourself, don't loll your tongue, try to button up your shirt and things like that. But it's all about controlling your temper and being self-mastered, and so that you can interact productively and be a gentleman, is the way that they put it. But to be a gentleman meant to have self-control and self-discipline. And that's the source of Washington's greatness. So there are a couple really amazing moments. At the Battle of Newburgh, the troops are about to mutiny because they haven't been paid. Congress has no money, there's terrible inflation, and the troops have years of back pay, and they're going to overthrow Washington, and it may be a total coup.
Wait. Yeah, Congress didn't act?
Amazingly, can you believe it? Is it possible that Congress, and that was the Articles of Confederation Congress, which is, even more paralyzed than ours. There was talk about a government shutdown. They were not going to pay those soldiers. So what does Washington do? He mounts this wooden structure called the Temple of Virtue. That's how much he's been reading the classics, and also Cato, which is a play by Joseph Addison, the great British playwright, which talks about the importance of self-mastery and the consolations of mild philosophy, which is Washington's favorite line. And he loves this show so much, he has it performed for the troops. They've got to see it so they can learn self-mastery themselves. So Washington mounts the Temple of Virtue, and he calls for patience and prudence, all the classical virtues, and says, if you can just have patience, then you'll be paid. And then he is having trouble reading his speech, so he brings out his reading glasses as he tries to read the speech, and the soldiers are stunned. They've never seen him confess weakness like this, and he said, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I've grown old in your service, now I've grown almost blind." And the soldiers weep because he's kind of showing himself. And it's a very studied performance. He's not, letting it all hang out. He's performing the role of the self-mastered leader. And that does the trick. And they don't rebel, and the war is won as a result. And that's the key to his leadership. He does the same thing in the Constitutional Convention, where he says almost nothing, but it's just the calm presence of his powerful personality that allows the delegates to create a strong presidency, because everyone knows he's going to be the first president. And his performance as president is absolutely masterful. He's got these incredibly strong advisors of polar opposite philosophies, Hamilton and Jefferson, from whose debate all subsequent political and constitutional debates flow, which is the subject of my next book, which I'm really excited about too. And Washington is always neutral, and he listens to both sides, and generally he sides with Hamilton, but sometimes with Jefferson. And Jefferson says that it's his neutrality and self-mastery and just his good judgment that's the source of his greatness. So he also draws, as you said, this crucial connection between personal self-government and political self-government. What does that mean? The framers are constructing a republic which has never before been tried in human history on a large scale. And that's why Hamilton in the Federalist Papers says this experiment is to test the proposition, can a republic be constructed by reason and conviction, not force or violence? Can we construct a republic around reason and not force, or thugs or kings or czars? And the way...
A quick side note,
Yeah.
Plato, who wrote the Republic, and you note in your book, he felt that a republic could only really be successful with 5,040 or less citizens. Why?
Exactly, because they have to be able to deliberate face to face. And you can't fit more than 6,000 people into the Athenian stadium. So 6,000 is the maximum, 5,040. And the conventional wisdom is that republics can only exist in a small enough territory for people to be able to deliberate face to face. Madison turns that on his head. First he says, in all large republics of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. That's Federalist 55. The framers are really concerned about mobs because in Massachusetts, debtors are rioting. It's called Shays' Rebellion. Once again, the farmers, through inflation, can't pay their debts. They're mobbing the federal courthouse because they don't want to pay their debts. And the delegates think this is the end of property rights. We're going to have riots in the streets. We've got to construct a constitution that's constrained enough to achieve its common purposes, but free enough to guarantee liberty. How to do it? Well, the core of the insight is the connection between personal self-government and political self-government. Only if citizens can master themselves, achieve the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice, will they elect virtuous leaders who will tend to the common good rather than being like Caesar on horseback and flattering the mob and installing himself as a dictator for life. So that's why Washington, in his farewell address, is saying, without virtue, the republic will fall. Unless you, my fellow Americans, can find virtuous self-mastery in your own lives, then we're going to descend into factions. And a faction is any group, either a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the common good. That's Madison again in Federalist 10. Isn't it interesting to hear Madison use those words, passion and reason, in his definition of what a faction is and in his definition of what the republic is designed to achieve? And like Washington, he's drawing that connection. You know, if we don't cultivate moderation and temperance and thoughtfulness and an interest in the public good, then we're going to tweet ourselves to death. We're going to be, you know, owning the libs or owning the conservatives.
You have a line about that. Page 173. This is about James Madison. What would Madison make of American democracy today? An era in which Jacksonian populism looks restrained by comparison. Madison's worst fears of mob rule have been realized, and the cooling mechanisms he designed to slow down the formation of impetuous majorities have broken. The polarization of Congress in the 21st century, reflecting an electorate that has not been this divided since the time of the Civil War, has led to ideological warfare between parties that directly channels the passions of their most extreme constituents, precisely the type of factionalism the founders abhorred.
Yes. So, as you know, because I have the honor of running this great institution, the National Constitution Center, I have to be totally nonpartisan, and I'm not allowed to have any political opinions whatsoever. It's unconstitutional for me to have political opinions, but I'm trying here to just analyze how we have arrived in a situation that is indeed Madison's nightmare. How do I know it's Madison's nightmare? Because he's talking about how in all large groups, people become descend into the mob and are overcome by passion rather than reason. And the two big things that we have now, which is what Madison most feared, are first polarization. Remember, the founders didn't anticipate political parties at all, and they wanted a government above parties where people would just embrace the common good. As it happens, very quickly, in fact, at the very beginning, the two great parties arose, founded by none other than Madison and Jefferson for the Democratic Republicans, and Hamilton and John Adams and Washington for the Federalists. But they believed that the goal of the parties was to serve common interests and not to descend into passions. And we have achieved a polarization that is greater than at any time since before the Civil War. And the other thing that Madison hoped was that new media technologies would slowly diffuse reason across the land. And he's really excited when he learns about the broadside press, which will publish the Federalist Papers, which he wrote with Hamilton to defend the Constitution. And Madison's idea is that this new technology, the broadside press, will print the Federalist Papers, citizens will discuss it in coffee houses, they'll read these long essays, and a new class of enlightened journalists that he calls the literati will help defend the Federalist Papers, and people will read those long and thoughtful essays, and slowly reason will diffuse across the land. Well, it's not a partisan statement. It's just stating the bleedingly obvious to say that we're living in a world that's very far from the Republic of Reason that Madison had in mind, largely because these new media technologies are the opposite of slowly diffusing reason. It's enraged to engage. It is posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason. It's tweeting your most extreme partisan thoughts rather than trying to deliberate and listen to competing opinions. And as a result, we're seeing a profusion of the kind of mob and factionate rhetoric that Madison most feared. So it's a very serious state of affairs that the founders feared, but were not, might not have been surprised by, because they don't know whether the experiment will succeed. It's really striking. They've all read the history of Greece and Rome. And Madison, during the Constitutional Convention, reads a trunk full of books that Jefferson has sent over from Paris, all about the failed confederacies of Greece and Rome. And he takes notes about what was it that led them to fail, trying to construct America so that we would slow down deliberation and not allow mobs to form quickly. And by the time they did, Madison hoped they would get tired and go home. And Madison is so, he turns Plato on his head. He said, Plato thinks that you can only have a republic, in a small community where people can deliberate face to face. Madison says, in America, it's different. Two things are different. First, we can have representation, so you don't need to have everyone deliberating face to face. And second, the fact that the republic is so big will make it hard for mobs to organize. And by the time they do, they'll get tired. And he thinks that size is actually a good way of cooling passions. Now, once again, technology has undermined Madison's hopes because representation is less of a cooling mechanism because our representatives are pandering directly to their base. They're actually, the idea of a tweeting president is a Madisonian nightmare because he thought the president's not even supposed to communicate with citizens directly. It has to be cooled by representation. And the other thing is that because the advantages of size have all been undermined by social media too, because no longer does it take weeks for media to travel, but it happens instantly and impulse rather than long-range thinking rules. So these are really challenging problems, but at the end of their lives, the founders are not all sure that the republic will succeed. Washington is alarmed by the rise of factions. Adams thinks that the president is too weak to resist demagogues, and Caesar, a thought shared by Hamilton on his death. Jefferson is properly haunted by slavery and foresees civil war, thinks that the republic may break apart on the question of slavery. Only Madison is slightly more optimistic because he expects less and has a lot of faith in reason. But Madison's faith is all hinging on us, on we citizens, doing what you're doing tonight, which is, spending an hour and a half to actually think about ideas and history is a radical act nowadays. And it was key to what Madison thought was necessary for the republic to succeed.
I want to, when you're on that topic, also talk about Alexis de Tocqueville. Some of you may have heard of Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote the authoritative book, Democracy in America, in the 1800s, early 1800s. And I remember from my reading of that, one of the many passages that stuck in my mind is that where in Europe you will find a man of wealth or an aristocrat to accomplish a given public purpose, in America you will find an association. And
Yes.
When I think of the Owls Club,
Yes.
I think of Alexis de Tocqueville sitting among you and saying and observing, because that's what he did. He was essentially a journalist. So he observed, and he wrote what he observed when he was touring all across America, a Frenchman. And he would be sitting in this crowd right now going, this is kind of interesting. A group of people who is intent on continuing to learn, on finding out, maybe some pages of history that they might have missed, but that forever learning concept and having an association of people. Not all of you think alike, not all of you are politically aligned. You may be very different in what you think or you believe, but you're all here together tonight as an association to help promote something that you think is worthwhile. And de Tocqueville, mentioned in your book, is a central figure as an observer, not so much as an American framer, but let's talk about him a little bit.
You're absolutely right. This is a Tocquevillian dream, indeed, and he thought that it was the core of what he called self-interest properly understood, which for him was a synonym for the pursuit of happiness. So he's reading the same classical moral philosophy, and he thinks that when you think about it, you'll realize that our long-term self-interest as citizens and as individuals is best served by delayed gratification, by lifelong learning, by convening with people that we disagree about so that we can compromise. And he thinks, as you said, it's so good to focus on that, that's the key to American success. Now, he's worried that it will be undermined by the rise of what he calls hyper-individualism. And he thinks when people just become so focused on themselves that they are only thinking about themselves and their own ego and not the common good, then they won't be able to engage in that kind of delayed gratification. And Tocqueville hopes that the spirit of religion will calm people's egoism and will allow them to take the long view. So for him, the religious aspects of communal organizations are crucial, but whether they were religious or whether they were civic, he thought it was central. And I'll just share the fact that the Constitution Center it's just a marvelous institution created by Congress during the bicentennial, though we're a private nonprofit, to engage in constitutional education in a nonpartisan way. And we convene groups of kids and teachers and citizens online to listen to differing points of view. And we always have liberal and conservative voices, and we only talk about constitutional issues and not political issues, and are trying to spark a movement across America for these kind of convenings. But for adult, lifelong learners to gather is a rare thing nowadays when people are so polarized and also on their screens so much. And I'm very moved to be here. I'm very glad that we're all convening here. I think what we're doing is a model for what Tocqueville Hope would say of the Republic.
Well, I want to give you an opportunity to, in a sense, plug your next book, because there's a section in here having to do with the feud, if you will, between Hamilton and Jefferson. And this is very important, as you noted, in American history, and a lot of things centering around the election of 1800. So let's go back for a moment, and in today's modern parlance, would Hamilton have said that Jefferson is a troll? and vice versa.
He said a lot worse than that. They were really, they had amazing epithets for each other.
It was nasty.
The great llama of the mountain, hermaphrodite. I mean, Hamilton did accuse Jefferson of having kids with Sally Hemings, and he was right. But that came out at the time. You know, it wasn't a secret. Jefferson just denied it for 200 years until the DNA.
What was at the core of their difference, and why is it so important?
He did. He was busted once they.
What was at the core of their differences, and why is it so important to modern America?
I love this topic. I'm just consumed by it every day. It's the most obvious topic in American history, but tracing it out to the present is like golden and silver threads that run throughout American history. Sometimes they intersect, sometimes they cross, sometimes they break apart, but they're always side by side. So the whole thing is set up by this dinner party they had in 1792, not the one that the musical celebrates, where they agreed to move the capital to D.C. in exchange for, the deal on the debt, on the assumption of the debt. This was a dinner party that took place the following year, and Hamilton goes to Jefferson's house and says, "Hey, who are those guys? The portraits of those three guys in your dining room?" And Jefferson says, "Those are, I think, the three greatest men who ever exist: John Locke and Isaac Newton and Sir Francis Bacon." And Hamilton, according to Jefferson, blurts out, "The greatest man who ever lived was Julius Caesar." And then the dinner goes on a little more, and John Adams is there, and Adams says, "The British Constitution would be perfect if it was purged of its corruption." And Hamilton blurts out, "Take away corruption and you deprive the British Constitution of what makes it the most perfect in the world." So Jefferson concludes Hamilton is for not only a monarchy, but a monarchy bottomed on corruption. He wants to be Caesar, and that's when he founds the Democratic Republican Party, in opposition to what he says is Hamilton's monarchical Caesarism and devotion to consolidation. Jefferson will favor states' rights. And in opposition to Hamilton's liberal construction of the Constitution in trying to defend the Bank of the United States, Jefferson will defend strict construction. And in opposition to what Jefferson says is Hamilton's preference for monarchy, Jefferson defends democracy. So, national power versus states' rights, liberal versus strict construction, democracy versus republicanism, these are the great battle of ideas that defined the clash between the Jeffersonian Republicans and the Hamiltonian Federalists all the way up until the duel and then 1826. It's what redefines the new Republican and Whig parties and the Democratic parties after the Civil War. And then the parties switch, and using what one scholar called Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends, the Democrats become the party of big government and support a large administrative state in order to defend the Jeffersonian values of economic justice and individual liberty. And the Republicans, starting in the age of Reagan, who says that he left the Democratic Party because they abandoned the ideals of Jefferson, becomes the party of states' rights and individual liberty and strict construction. And President Reagan pledges to appoint justices who will interpret the Constitution in light of original understanding and strictly construe it, just as Jefferson had done in opposition to Hamilton's Bank. So that's the big story, and just it's so exciting to trace through the various invocations of Hamilton and Jefferson at every stage in American history. Both are invoked on all sides of every political debate. Jefferson is a protean character, as one of his biographers said. So Franklin Roosevelt has the gall, the chutzpah, to call himself the second coming of Jefferson and he sponsors the Jefferson Memorial and has fake Monticellos everywhere, even as he's embracing a version of big government that, would have made Jefferson shudder. And yet Jefferson himself betrayed his own principles when he bought Louisiana. The biggest, he doubles the size of the United States. He's convinced that it violates the Constitution and strict construction, but he agrees to do it anyway because he thinks it's really important. And then in the Dred Scott case, the Jeffersonian Chief Justice, Roger Taney, strikes down the Missouri Compromise, embracing precisely the same strict construction of the Constitution that Jefferson himself had rejected over Louisiana. So there's a lot of opportunistic shifting back and forth, but it's exciting and majestic, and it's a grand battle of ideas that defines the core of America, and it's going to be out right in time for 2026, so you've got to have me back to talk about it then.
All right. I would do a couple of things here before we get to, we've actually been talking for almost an hour, believe it or not, and I want to take some questions from the audience too. And I want to talk about the modern era and relating all of this. But my first question on that topic is, I'm curious if your research into all of this whole era of these virtues and the discipline and all of that allows you to look at what people are saying today about our current era. I hear things like, these are the worst times we've ever lived in. Congress has never been so divided. People have never been so divided. The Supreme Court has never been worse, et cetera, okay? I mean, you hear people say those kinds of things. And there is an availability bias in that. We didn't live in the 1700s, so we don't know what this difference was between Jefferson and Hamilton. We don't know what things were like during the Civil War because we weren't there, okay? So how do you look at where we live today and the conditions and the environment in which we find ourselves and compare that to any moment in history in terms of, is it worse now than it's ever been, or is it about the same, or is it getting better, getting worse? Where do we stand?
It was really bad. And in fact, the violence, threats to the Constitution, and mob insurrections during the election of 1800 and leading up to and after the Civil War are worse than they were today. 1800, Hamilton is rising a regiment on horseback that's prepared to, and some of the New England states want to secede. Hamilton's changing the election rules after the fact in order to avoid Burr's election. And there's a really serious question about whether, Jefferson and Burr will accept the election results. The system might well have fallen. The Civil War period is really striking, and the more the history you learn, the degree of mob lynch violence, both before the war, when abolitionist newspapers and black people are being lynched and burned, of course, during the war, and then after the war in Reconstruction, you have to have federal enforcement of the right to vote, and the moment that the troops leave, and even when they're subverted, just mass riots, mobs, hundreds of people burned and lynched at a time not at all. At the election of 1876, when the whole thing almost came apart because it wasn't clear who won the electoral vote, they're afraid that there's going to be a new civil war, and then the states are going to secede once again. And on the floor of Congress, people are beating each other up. Charles Sumner, the great abolitionist, author of the Civil Rights Bill, is caned almost to death by some Southern congressman who takes a cane and just bashes his head in because he doesn't like Sumner's politics, and people fight duels when they feel like they're insulted. People would run for Congress in those days on the ground. My left hook is better than the other guy. I'm going to be able to really beat my opponent up. It's a very, very serious thing. And the Insurrection Act, which Hamilton had first sponsored to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, Jefferson actually renews to prosecute Aaron Burr, who he accuses of treason. His own vice president is on the lam, accused of treason in a trial presided over by the Chief Justice because they fear he's running a secessionist conspiracy in New Orleans. And the Insurrection Act authorizes the calling of troops, and then Lincoln calls it again. There are labor riots that follow the Civil War. So it's very, very bad. Now, we can talk about differences and similarities. The most obvious difference is just social media allows people to express their opinions and also to broadcast everything in real time. So we certainly have a greater awareness of what's going on the ground. And the factionalism seems to be greater just because people won't, just tweeting 24/7. Mm-hmm. But in terms of actual existential threats to the institutions themselves and the degree of violence in the streets, it was worse then.
Yeah. If I may quote you again, page 278, the founders would not have been surprised that heavy use of social media increases anxiety and decreases happiness. Their neo-Stoic understanding of emotional intelligence emphasized the importance of deliberation and thinking before you speak. Social media rewards immediate responses and tweeting before you think. The founders counseled moderation in speech. Social media rewards extremism. The founders urged the need to think for yourself and form opinions without seeking the approval of the crowd. On social media, popular approval in the form of likes, tweets, and shares is the only currency. And a little farther down, in the founders' time, books were scarce and access to them was precious. This is very important. Today, by contrast, the miracle of the internet has given us access to all the surviving texts published since the dawn of time on our cell phones and our tablets, wherever we are, at every moment of every day, often free of charge. When I was young, I remember visiting the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. with my mother for the first time. As I stood in the great hall of the magnificent Thomas Jefferson Building, I was filled with wonder at the thought that all the books in the world could be found in one place. Only a few decades later, for the first time in human history, we carry in our pockets all the wisdom of the ages, including the complete works of the ancient thinkers who inspired the founders, and actual copies of the books and editions that the founders themselves read. All we need is the self-discipline to take the time to read them. Here, the founders themselves are an inspiration. As their example shows, it helps to set aside dedicated time every day for deep reading rather than idle browsing and sharing. I have given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus, Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, Jefferson wrote to Adams. And I find myself much the happier. In their quest to become more perfect, the founders fell short of many of their own ideals, except for lifelong learning, where youthful habits led most of them to keep up a disciplined daily reading schedule until the end of their lives. The Owls Club.
Absolutely. Thank you for reading that. And yes, friends, that's my takeaway from this project, just the radically empowering act of daily reading. I'd gotten out of the habit of doing it. I read a lot when I was at school, and I still read for work, but I got out of the habit of reading stuff that wasn't directly related to my work. And I found, first of all, I really want to stress again, it just blows my mind that all the books in the world are right here. It's so exciting. We're so fortunate. We're so blessed to live in this time when all the books are here and basically free, and we just carry them around with us. And I do remember that being so full of wonder with my mom at the Library of Congress. And for all of the distractions of these devices, and I'm as addicted to this as many of us, we have the capacity to learn and grow with self-discipline. And habits are so important. So just, I did that weird get up with the sun for Jefferson thing, and now I have a really simple rule that I want to share with you. And I bet that many of you practice a version of this already. When I wake up, I am not allowed to browse. I have to actually read a book for an hour or two before I can check email or check the blogs or whatever. And it's just become a habit. And I always, my finger is twitching and I want to, swipe right to the blog rather than left to the book, but I'm not allowed to. and it just changes your life. It's amazing how much you can learn by spending an hour actually reading books. And the fact that they're all free is here. And I have to say, when I think about how people had to struggle in those days to get books, and Adams and Jefferson, they're 80 years old, and they're excitedly trading the latest books that have arrived in Paris and asking each other to track down books. And I have to share this example. Frederick Douglass, the greatest abolitionist of his time, when is he feeling the most enslaved? When his wicked master said he's not allowed to learn how to read. And when he feels that his mind is being shackled, he resolves to break free. He goes onto the streets of Baltimore. He buys reading lessons with bread. He pays these boys to teach him how to read with bread. And then he buys with bread this golden book called the Columbian Orator, which is a primer with selections from the classics, Cicero and Seneca and all these guys. And he says it totally transforms his life. He resolves to become an abolitionist, and he becomes the greatest fighter and foe of slavery of his time. If Douglass and Lincoln, who had to pay for books with corn, and Adams and Jefferson, and all these people throughout history could make such sacrifices just to get access to books, I feel it's the least I can do to swipe left rather than right and just read the book. And it's just a great habit. It's all about habits. I know you're all readers and you're lifelong learners, and together, let's spend our mornings and days reading and growing.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk just briefly about the National Constitution Center, because we've mentioned it several times. It is a nonpartisan organization, and you also have a podcast. You know, read the book, yes, but also listen to the podcast, right?
Listen to the podcast and check out the amazing, transformative, interactive Constitution. It's free and online at constitutioncenter.org. Here's what you'll find here. I'm so proud to be part of the team that put this together. The leading liberal and conservative thinkers in America, like Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal, are writing about 80 clauses of the Constitution with 1,000 words about what they agree it means, and then separate statements about what they disagree. Isn't that amazing? You can click on the habeas corpus clause and see Justice Barrett and Neil Katyal about what they agree and disagree about. Multiply that by 80 clauses, and it's just this feast of civility and deep learning that will send you in all sorts of important directions. And then, linked to each clause are podcasts, where every week I get to talk to liberal and conservative historians and thinkers about the meaning of questions in the news and throughout history. Primary source documents selected by liberal and conservative historians, and this great Constitution 101 class. I know 25 of you took a Constitution class, and I'm so glad that it provoked such great discussions. The rest of you who want to check out a free resource, check out Constitution 101. There are 15 videos with, I do some of them, and we're about to launch with Khan Academy, the great online content provider, a version of it with America's greatest scholars, 30 liberal and conservative historians, all teaching Constitution 101 for free. It just blows my mind. It's so inspiring to see these great minds. They agree about much, they disagree about much too, but all in this free resource. And then, finally, I feel like a Ginsu knife salesman. That's not all. We also have public discussions and lifelong learning seminars, both online and around the country, with great historians talking about their books, with journalists debating constitutional issues in the news. Those are all on Zoom. We're traveling, and we just came back from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then finally, if that's not enough, it's also this unbelievable museum of the Constitution right on Independence Mall in Philadelphia, across from Independence Hall, the room where it happened. It's got the greatest view of Independence Hall in America. It's this towering palace of the Constitution designed by I.M. Pei with, this soaring view of Independence Hall and live theater for kids and statues of the founders, the Signers Hall, where you can see all 55 signers in bronze and touch them, and kids like to sort of feel like they're connecting to them, and exhibits about the First Amendment and Reconstruction. It's just marvelous. It's this great civic resource. So I hope if you come to Philly, I hope you'll see it, but do go online to constitutioncenter.org and make this part of your lifelong learning. And of course, part of the challenge of lifelong learning is framing discussion topics in a way where you can productively have conversations. And it's very hard to do for politics because people disagree, and you can't really do it for purely political issues. But if you take a constitutional issue, take one in the news, even the tough questions like, should there be immunity for President Trump, which the Supreme Court just heard, you got to do a lot of reading before you can have thoughtful opinions on both sides of that. That's what the podcast does. It kind of surfaces them. But you can also read the briefs on both sides, listen to some experts, and then when the opinions come down, this is a great discussion topic, read the Supreme Court opinions and read not only the majority opinions, but the dissents too. I always tell learners, you got to read the majority and the dissents. I did this on a middle school class recently, and a kid put in the Zoom chat, I'm Bill, I'm 11, I'm not sure I can read the dissent. I said, I know you can do it, Bill. And he did, because starting in middle school, anyone can do it. And it's a civic exercise. These Supreme Court opinions, you don't have to read all the legalese, but you'll get the gist of it, because they're written for you. Just take the time, is really all it needs. The time and commitment to reading the majority and the dissent before you make up your own minds. Evaluate them in constitutional, not political terms, not do I want this result or that result, I think Trump should get immunity or not, but what do you think the Constitution says? And then you probably have to learn a little bit about the methods of interpretation. Are you a strict constructionist and originalist like Thomas Jefferson, or a liberal constructionist like Alexander Hamilton and John Marshall and Justice Breyer, who has a new great book out about all this? And when you evaluate the questions in those terms, sometimes you reach conclusions where your political impulses differ from your constitutional conclusions. You might think Trump shouldn't get immunity, but the Constitution grants it, or that he should, but the Constitution denies it. And that's when you know that you're thinking like the constitutional lawyer. But it's such an honor to lead the National Constitution Center. It's this great free resource, and I really hope that the Owl Club will turn to it and incorporate it into your learning.
On the way over here from the airport, from South Bend International to Elkhart, we were talking in the car, and I said, it's interesting when you read things on Facebook or on Twitter or Instagram or, God forbid, TikTok. I mean, everyone's an expert. Every opinion you read is like, oh, I know this. Truth is, most people don't, because they don't take the time to read it, and that discipline of reading something every day, whether it's constitutional or whether it's historical, whether it's in the arts or poetry. We've mentioned that many times. I don't know anybody who writes poetry, do you? But take the time to do that, and I think maybe take the time off, from some of the social media stuff and devote it to those particular avenues, and I think it would be very, very helpful. I have a couple of announcements, and I'm going to come out and take some of your questions. This is really great. Jeffrey Rosen's book, The Pursuit of Happiness, will be distributed to you at the end of the program. If you'd like Jeff to autograph your book as you leave, you're going to exit through the south doors in the sanctuary over that way, okay? So if you get your book and go that way, Jeff would be happy to sign it. If you don't want to stay, but you'd still like to get a signed copy of the book, you can exit through the main doors and add your name to the list that's out there at the book table, and we will get it done for you. And OWLS members are encouraged to bring their books to the campus tomorrow morning between 8:30 and 9:30. Jeff will be here to autograph books. So thank you very much for that. And I am going to, before we take a big round of applause here, I'm going to see if anybody's got any questions. Who has a question for Jeff Rosen? Oh, over there. Okay. Watch me walk all that way. Hey, this works. Yes, sir. How you doing? Good to see you.
See you.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, my wife just leaned over and quietly whispered in my ear, "Don't ask any questions." I'm in trouble to start with.
Temper your passions.
You might remember when Benjamin Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention, someone asked him, "What kind of government do we have, Dr. Franklin?" He reportedly said, "A republic, if you could keep it." 2 or 3 years ago, I had a chance to go to Lake Michigan College and hear John Meacham, who you probably know, who gave a talk. And before he spoke, several of us had a chance to talk to him and meet him personally and ask him questions. And one of the questions he was asked at the time was, in view of the divisiveness in the country, where do you see us going? And his answer surprised me, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about it. He said, you know, republics have a life cycle, and I'm afraid that we are nearing the end of our life cycle. That surprised many of us. Someone then said, well, how many years do you think we have left in the cycle? And he said, well, nobody knows, but he said, based on an historical perspective, I would guess perhaps 25 years. And then I said, well, if that's the case, what will replace our republic? And his answer was some sort of a combination between an industrial military complex, something to that effect. I would be interested in your thoughts on his comments.
Wow. Well, that's the big one. That's the central question, of course. And you're absolutely right to quote Franklin. And now, you know, through this moral philosophy, we understand what Franklin meant when he said, if you can keep it, if we, the citizens, can find the virtuous self-mastery, the temperance, the moderation, the self-discipline to avoid demagogues, the mob, and authoritarianism, which beset every other republic in history. Would we be like Rome, where, you know, the Roman Republic voluntarily surrendered to Caesar, who offered cheap bribes and entertainments and allowed him to subvert republican institutions and install himself as emperor for life before he was assassinated. And that's the way republics fall. It is true that previous republics have fallen, and we've had a long run. Will we fall? No one knows, of course. No, and is it 25 years? Is it much longer? I don't know, of course. And much turns on contingencies, small coincidences or elections or a series of events or choices can make the difference between survival and not. The World War I, of course, happened because of a series of unconnected events that just exploded, and the Civil War, too, although it was building over a period of time, happened because of Lincoln's election. Now, we emerged from the Civil War because of a commitment to the Constitution. It took a really long time, and Reconstruction was totally subverted for almost 100 years when it came to equal rights for black people, subverted through mob violence and by the Supreme Court and by resistance. It's not a pretty story. And yet, the arc does bend upward, and that's the point of Martin Luther King at the Mall. 1963, he's saying we have to make good on the promissory note that is the Declaration, remembering always that the arc of history bends upward. And so far, with the help of Providence and fortune, the arc has bent upward, and it's been a series of setbacks and disappointments and shortcomings, but always moving forward and always becoming more perfect and always becoming more embracive. And at 250 years, we can look back on the arc bending upward. So regardless of what happens in this election or in the next couple of years, the institutions may be severely tested. The problems we're talking about are very serious. The technologies of polarization and anger are novel. And yet, we have this precious inheritance, which is a commitment to the ideals of the Constitution and the Declaration, and this great habit as Americans of defending freedom and insisting always on returning to the lodestar, the keystone of the arch of our government, as Jefferson called it, that is the Constitution. So, you know, I can be pessimistic or optimistic on any particular morning, but since you asked me, I think I will choose to be optimistic, like King and like Lincoln and like Reagan and like all the great leaders who have always seen the arc bending upward. But here's the point, and it's important. It depends on us. It depends on you and me. And, you know, we're the ones who are going to keep it or not. And regardless of how an election goes, maybe you like the result or maybe you don't. But you can't just say, I'm going to secede. You can't just say, I'm going to take up arms. That's not what we do in America. Regardless of who wins, you have to, first of all, tend to yourself. Do more reading, do more learning, so you can evaluate what's going on. And you can answer the question better than I can about what history teaches us, and then defend those institutions. And for goodness sakes, let's inspire our kids to do it too, because we're all really in trouble unless our kids are going to take the time to defend these institutions. I will say what makes me most concerned is that people are not reading anymore. Even the most privileged kids in the fanciest universities are not reading books. And if they can't, because they're so distracted by this social media, and if they're not taking the time to read, then how can we expect it for people who are far less privileged? That's why I think it's very important for us. I'm going to talk about us together, because we're all lifelong learners, just to model it by reading on our own. And when you're talking about politics and so forth, just try to base your thoughts on stuff you're reading deeply, which is why it's so good to read history. And this is another really important thing. Washington says we've got to have a national university where people from across the country can come to study history so that they'll defend liberty and have the habits of deliberation. And he says people of different backgrounds from across the country will set aside their regional and parochial allegiances and will learn the habits of deliberation through deep reading of history. Very inspiring. We can do it now, for goodness sakes. We've got this great internet, we've got the interactive constitution, we have the Owls Clubs. You have all the resources you need. And we've got all the books in the world on our cell phones. Isn't this great? We're in such great shape to do the deep reading and discussion that the founders hoped. So none of us individually or even as a group can just, save the country, but we can keep learning and growing. And I have to be optimistic that if we keep doing that, the Republic will continue to thrive.
One thing I love about what you said, thank you, yeah. One thing I absolutely love about what you just said is that it's one thing to read for yourself, which is great, and we should all do that. But keep in mind that when you're reading, little eyes see you reading, right? Mm-hmm. And what do kids do best?
Yeah.
They emulate the people that they see. They behave like that. And if they see that dedication to, what are you doing? I'm reading, okay? They tend to do the same sorts of things. And hopefully we inculcate that in our youngsters as well. Who else has a question? I'm going to come back this way. Oh, I don't know, the first person I get to. Here you go. I'm going to be Phil Donahue.
Hi. Yeah, Dr. Rosen. I do my reading, late morning reading by walking my dog and listening to audiobooks. And this morning I was listening to a book called, strangely, Evil Geniuses by Kurt Anderson. Your name came up, not as an evil genius, but you were quoted as saying, we're all originalists now. And then he went on to deal with Robert Bork, whom he does think is an evil genius, who Anderson says basically he's an originalist when originalism agrees with his views and not so much when he doesn't agree. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about originalist. I know you could go on for hours about that.
Thank you. Really important question. Anderson is, if he quotes, attributing it to me, I was quoting Justice Elena Kagan, who said we're all originalists now. She said it at Justice Scalia's portrait unveiling at Harvard Law School, and she was paying tribute to Justice Scalia for having so transformed the terms of constitutional debate. She was then the dean of Harvard. She said everyone, liberals and conservatives, are all originalists now because everyone has to make arguments about text and history. They may not stop there, but even the liberals on the Supreme Court today are all making arguments about text and history, and they're making the point that, I forgot if I said that about Bork or if his critics do, the liberal dissenters today are calling the conservatives bad originalists. They're saying you're just shifting around between text and history and pragmatic arguments to reach your preferred results. You say, Justice Scalia and other originalists, that you only are bound by the text and history in order to separate your political from your philosophical and personal views. The liberals say, we don't think you're doing that. We think you're hypocrites, essentially. And that's why it's so interesting to read the dissents nowadays. Read, for example, the opinion where the court said that Colorado couldn't kick President Trump off the ballot. It was all an argument about original understanding, and the conservatives say, I think they said the text, Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment, and therefore it's not self-executing, that it can't go into effect unless Congress has passed a law authorizing it to go into effect. And the liberals say, what are you making up this self-executing requirement? The Section 5 doesn't say that Congress has to act before the 14th Amendment can go into effect. We don't say that for any other provision. And here's all of this history showing that the Civil War Congress disqualified former Confederate insurrectionists without a law being passed. In fact, the central Supreme Court precedent on the question says you don't need a congressional law. So the very nature of the debate was exactly that. Now, these are complicated debates. They're really interesting. It's not like they're all that legal, but they involve different interpretations of whether you should focus on the plain meaning of the text, what history you should look to, and when, if ever, pragmatic considerations trump history. In the immunity debate, once again, we'll see what the court does, but at oral argument, the conservatives seem to be saying that if we don't create a broad immunity for the president, then future presidents will prosecute their rivals, and a president might be afraid to leave office, as Justice Alito said, because he might fear prosecution. And the liberals say, well, first of all, what are you talking about, this hypothetical? We actually had a president who didn't leave office because he thought he, won, and it wasn't because he feared prosecution. And the liberals also say, where are you getting this immunity argument? It's not in the text or history. Hamilton and all the founders stood up repeatedly and said the president's liable to prosecution when he leaves office. It's just a pragmatic argument, and that is exactly what you conservatives say you're not for. I'm not going to tell you who to be more persuaded by in any of these debates. They're obviously complicated debates where people have both sides. But I am struck in reading history that these debates have been going on since the beginning. And this is what Jefferson and Hamilton are exactly debating about in Congress's power to charter the bank. Should you strictly construe the word necessary in the clause of the Constitution that says that Congress can do anything necessary and proper to carry out its responsibilities? Should that mean absolutely necessary and indispensable, as Jefferson the textualist says? Or should it mean convenient or useful or practically adapted, as Hamilton says? And that's the originalism-pragmatism debate. John Marshall sides with Hamilton, Chief Justice Taney with Jefferson, and it goes back and forth. I'm also struck, because it's so interesting, every side throughout history has made that same accusation of hypocrisy that Kurt Anderson attributed to Robert Bork. And in some cases, it's fair. Jefferson was a total hypocrite when it came to the Louisiana Purchase. He literally tells his aides, I think this does violate the strict construction of the necessary and proper clause, but I just think it's really important to do, so I'm going to do it anyway. And the Supreme Court sometimes does that too. So I think, I won't hide the ball. I guess I'll say, historically, the court has indeed been pretty, let's call it opportunistic, about its application of these principles, and the strict constructionists tend to abandon their principles when they really care about a result. And let's just say that there's a strong case that that may be going on today as well.
Jeffrey, thank you. We are at our allotted time. And I just want to compliment all of you. I told, Frank was talking to me a few weeks ago, and I said, how many people are coming? And he said, well, I think about 350. He said, I really wanted 500. And I said, Frank, I've been doing these things for I don't know how long, 35 years. And I said, if you get 350 people to come out and talk about the Constitution for an hour and a half, that's amazing.
It's amazing.
So congratulations to the Owls Club and your presence here. This has been fantastic. Jeffrey, we want to thank you so much for making the trip out here. Your book is wonderful, and I promise to read it 2 hours every morning before sunrise.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff
Thanks
Rosen.
all of you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.